In the heart of a vibrant but overlooked neighborhood, where the hum of the city streets could be heard even in the early morning, there lived a man whose name had yet to be written into the annals of artistic greatness. His name was Xavier Williams, but to most of the world, he was just another black artist trying to survive in a world that often seemed more intent on ignoring him than celebrating his talent. Xavier's story wasn't one of instant fame or recognition. It was a story of quiet resilience, a tale of passion enduring against the suffocating weight of rejection. He had always known, from a young age, that art was his calling. Growing up in a modest home with his single mother, Xavier had found comfort in drawing. The walls of their small apartment were plastered with his sketches, each one a world of possibilities. He could recall the moments when he would sit for hours in front of an old, dusty canvas his mother had salvaged from a yard sale, pouring every ounce of emotion into his strokes. Each image he created was more than just paint on a surface. It was his way of navigating a world that often felt hostile, chaotic, and unforgiving. Xavier was a natural. His talent was undeniable, raw, and unrefined, but it radiated with a vibrancy that caught the eye of anyone who took a moment to look. His brushstrokes had a life of their own, and there was a fire in his eyes that hinted at a profound understanding of the world that most people never took the time to notice. However, that fire had yet to spark in the places that mattered most, the prestigious art galleries, the auction houses, and the elite circles that determined who would become a celebrated name. Every morning, Xavier would wake before dawn, his dreams filled with visions of the world recognizing his work, of the streets lined with his art and the whispers of admiration in the crowd. But those dreams collided with the harsh realities of the art world, where galleries rejected him time and again, citing his work as too bold, too daring, or simply not what people want. It was a rejection that wasn't just personal, it was an exclusion rooted in systemic barriers that black artists faced, a world that had, for centuries, overlooked the contributions of people of color to the cultural landscape. At the local gallery openings, Xavier found himself standing in the shadows, observing the work of others hanging on the walls, work that lacked the depth and soul of his own. Yet, their creators, often from privileged backgrounds or established circles, were celebrated and championed. He knew he had something that could change the world, yet the world was not willing to change to make room for him. The bitterness of these repeated rejections slowly began to creep into his soul. There were nights when his hands shook with frustration, when the passion that had once fueled his every stroke felt like it was beginning to dim. But Xavier was no stranger to struggle. He had seen hardship all his life, yet his mother had always told him one thing: your worth is not determined by what others see in you, but by what you see in yourself. It was a mantra that became his anchor in the stormy sea of doubt and despair. When the rejections piled up, he kept painting, kept creating. His work became more personal, more raw. It was no longer just about creating for the sake of art, it became a fight for his identity, his existence. Each piece was a defiance, a refusal to be ignored. Still, every opportunity seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. He watched as other artists, some with far less talent but far more connections, made it into the galleries, their work praised, their names whispered among the elite. In contrast, his name barely reached the lips of those in the know, his pieces collecting dust in the corner of his small studio. There were days when he questioned whether he should just give up, whether the world had decided that his voice wasn't worth hearing. But then, he would pick up his brush again, each time feeling that spark reignite within him. Xavier's community knew him well, and they supported him, but their support, while deeply encouraging, could only go so far. The larger world, outside the warmth of his local neighborhood, still dismissed his art, still failed to see the beauty in the vivid colors and powerful themes he captured. He sold a few pieces here and there, often at small, independent art shows where he would meet kind-hearted people who truly appreciated his work. Yet, these buyers had little influence in the art world. They were not the ones who could open the doors to the high-end galleries or the auction houses where the real money was. Despite the setbacks, Xavier never stopped painting. The city streets outside his apartment continued to serve as his inspiration, with their dynamic mix of cultures, struggles, and triumphs. He painted scenes of resilience, of everyday people moving through the world with strength and grace, of the forgotten heroes who shaped the community. He poured his heart into his pieces, capturing emotions that could not be put into words. But still, the road ahead seemed so daunting. For every exhibition he tried to get into, for every gallery he approached, the response was always the same: not now. Your work doesn't quite fit our current vision. We'll keep you in mind for future opportunities. These words, though polite, stung deeply, and Xavier often found himself battling the heavy weight of disappointment that threatened to crush him. Yet through it all, his passion burned bright, and he never let go of the belief that his time would come. He knew, deep down, that true artistry could not be stifled forever. And one day soon, the world would finally see what he had to offer. But for now, Xavier continued, pushing through every obstacle with the same resolve that had carried him through every hardship in his life. His hands, though tired, never stopped creating. And through it all, he knew that as long as he kept going, there was still hope, a glimmer of light that promised the possibility of greatness, no matter how long it took to get there. The artist's humble beginnings were just the start of something greater. The world had not yet recognized his genius, but Xavier believed that in time, they would. The crisp autumn air carried with it a sense of both promise and dread. It was a morning that seemed no different from any other, except for one thing. Today, Xavier had secured a meeting with Harold Finch, the owner of one of the city's most prestigious galleries. Finch's gallery was known for its exclusivity, its impeccable taste, and for only showcasing the most established names in the art world. For many artists, having their work displayed in Finch's gallery was a milestone, an undeniable mark of recognition. To Xavier, this meeting felt like the chance he had been waiting for, the opportunity to step into the realm of success that had eluded him for so long. Xavier had heard rumors about Finch, about his supposed taste in art, his sharp eye for talent, and his connections within the world of collectors and critics. What Xavier didn't know, however, was that Finch was not only known for his condescension but also for his prejudices, an ugliness hidden beneath the surface of his polished exterior. He had an ingrained belief that the art world was an elite space for a select few, and unfortunately for Xavier, he wasn't part of that select group. The meeting was arranged through a mutual acquaintance, someone who believed in Xavier's work and thought it was worth showing Finch. Xavier had prepared for days, going over his portfolio, carefully selecting the pieces he felt best represented his growth as an artist. Each work had been chosen not just for its technical skill, but for the story it told. He knew this was his moment, the time when his art could speak for him in a way that words never could. He entered the gallery with a quiet confidence, dressed in a simple black jacket and dark jeans, holding a portfolio filled with his best pieces. Finch's gallery was a sprawling space, its white walls adorned with large, vibrant works of art. It felt like the kind of place where dreams were either made or shattered, depending on whose work was on display. Finch himself, however, was nowhere to be seen, leaving Xavier to wait in the bright, sterile lobby. The minutes stretched on, the anticipation building with each passing second. Xavier kept reminding himself to stay calm, to breathe, but the weight of the moment bore heavily on him. Finally, Harold Finch entered. He was a man in his early 50s, with slicked-back graying hair and a stiff, arrogant posture. His tailored suit seemed to ooze wealth, every inch of him radiating an air of superiority. He extended a hand, his grip firm but cold. "Xavier Williams, I presume?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of boredom. "Yes, Mr. Finch. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me," Xavier replied, offering a polite but firm handshake. He could already feel the power dynamics at play, the subtle way Finch looked down at him, assessing him like a piece of property. Yet Xavier remained composed, as he always did, even when every part of him wanted to scream. Finch gestured for him to follow as they walked through the gallery, the silence between them thick with unspoken expectations. They came to a small, well-lit corner of the gallery, and Finch motioned for Xavier to place his portfolio on the table. Xavier did so, heart racing but determined not to let his nerves show. He could feel Finch's eyes on him, scanning him like a man about to judge a piece of livestock. "Let's see what you have," Finch said with a wave of his hand, settling into one of the sleek, modern chairs that dotted the gallery. Xavier carefully opened the portfolio, revealing his first piece, a vivid portrayal of a community, bound by shared experience and strength, painted with bold colors and intricate detail. The energy in the piece was undeniable, a reflection of the power and resilience that had fueled Xavier's every stroke. He watched as Finch leaned in for a closer look, his lips curling into an expression of mild disinterest. Finch muttered, barely giving the piece more than a passing glance. It's colorful, I'll give you that. But it's too raw, too unrefined. The composition feels chaotic. A little all over the place, don't you think? Xavier's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his face neutral, his voice steady. I believe the chaos represents the real energy of the community. It's about life, about people who refuse to be overlooked. It's not meant to be clean or easy. It's about capturing a moment of truth, of emotion. Finch snorted dismissively, not even bothering to look at Xavier as he flipped through the next few pieces. I see what you're doing here, he said, his tone now laced with a patronizing edge. But let's be honest, this kind of art, it's not going to sell. No one's going to hang this on their walls. It's not tasteful, you know? It doesn't have that sophisticated touch people look for. It's not the kind of work that resonates with the high-end buyers I cater to. Xavier's pulse quickened, but he fought to keep his composure. Finch's words were cruel, dismissive, and yet somehow, they weren't surprising. He had encountered this kind of condescension before, art being reduced to a commodity, its worth dictated by those with the power to buy and sell, not by its meaning or the heart it poured into its creation. But what hurt more than the critique itself was the undertone of racism that seeped into Finch's remarks. The truth is, Finch continued, leaning back in his chair, art like yours is too niche. People like you, he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, can't be expected to understand what makes a piece valuable. You should really think about broadening your horizons. Maybe try something a little more conventional. He gave a smug, almost arrogant smile, as though he had imparted some great wisdom. Xavier's hands clenched at his sides, but he remained silent, the weight of the gallery owner's words pressing down on him. Finch's mockery was not just about the art, it was about Xavier himself, a man of color trying to break into a space that had long been dominated by white artists and their exclusive patrons. Finch's words, wrapped in false politeness, were nothing more than a reflection of the art world's deep-rooted biases, a system that often rejected talent if it didn't conform to its narrow ideals. Xavier took a slow breath, refusing to let the insult burn him. He knew that anger would only cloud his judgment, and it was not anger that would fuel his success, it was perseverance. I appreciate your feedback, Mr. Finch, Xavier said evenly, his voice carrying none of the anger he felt inside. But I think art is meant to push boundaries, to challenge the viewer, to make them see the world in a different way. I don't want to create what's easy or expected, I want to create what's true. Whether or not people understand it now, doesn't change its worth. Finch gave a small, dismissive chuckle. Well, that's admirable, I suppose. But don't get your hopes up. The art world doesn't have room for everyone, and frankly, there's no market for your work. You're talented, sure, but this isn't the place for you. Perhaps you'd do better in a different scene. One that's more fitting. Xavier stood there for a moment, looking at Finch with a quiet resolve. Thank you for your time, Mr. Finch, he said, packing up his portfolio with deliberate slowness. He knew this meeting wouldn't lead to anything, but he wasn't here to be validated by someone like Finch. He was here to stand firm in his belief that his art mattered, that his voice had a place in this world. As he walked out of the gallery, the weight of Finch's words tried to settle in his mind, but Xavier refused to let them take root. He was more than what Finch saw in him, more than the narrow confines of this world's expectations. And though the road ahead would be filled with many more doors slammed in his face, Xavier knew one thing for certain, he would not be stopped. His art, his vision, his truth would find a way, no matter how many people tried to put him down. He would rise, and when the world was ready to listen, he would make them see. Xavier Williams sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of the last few months pressing down on him with a force he could hardly escape. The rejection from Harold Finch, the glib dismissal of his work, had stung more than he had expected. He had hoped for an opportunity, a breakthrough, but what he received instead was a harsh reminder of how deeply rooted prejudice could be in the art world. The words of Finch, with their coldness and thinly veiled racism, had settled in his bones like a dark cloud that seemed to shadow every thought he had. But as the days passed, something began to change within him, a quiet shift in perspective, a realization that perhaps his journey was not meant to be defined by the judgments of others. Xavier continued to paint, though his brushes moved with a quiet frustration, as if he were painting against a tide of dismissals and unspoken biases. His studio was still the same humble space, a corner of his small apartment, its walls lined with unfinished works, sketches, and pieces he had been developing in isolation. He had tried to push the negative thoughts away, to focus on his craft and the message he wanted to send, but the world outside seemed to echo with the belief that his art, his talent, was not enough. He had heard that the art world was unforgiving, but nothing had prepared him for the bitterness of being overlooked time and time again, simply because of who he was. One evening, as he sat amidst the clutter of his work, an idea began to form. Perhaps he had been too focused on trying to impress the very people who had no interest in understanding him. Perhaps, instead, he needed to place his work in front of someone who would look at it with fresh eyes, someone who could see its true value, not through the lens of prejudice but through the lens of art itself. For the first time in months, Xavier felt a flicker of hope. He had heard stories of artists who had their work appraised, and many of them had been astonished by the value of their pieces, values that far exceeded what they had ever expected. Could it be that his work had been undervalued not because of its merit, but because of the color of his skin? It was with this thought in mind that Xavier made a decision. He would have his artwork appraised. He would not rely on galleries or critics to define his worth any longer. He would seek out an independent art appraiser, someone who had no preconceived notions about his background, his race, or his place in the art world. He would see for himself if his art truly held the value that he believed it did, beyond the dismissive words of gallery owners and the closed doors of the elite circles. The process of finding a reputable appraiser took time, but eventually, he settled on a firm known for its fair and honest evaluations. The appraiser, a woman named Julia Collins, came highly recommended by a fellow artist who had gone through the same journey. Xavier made the call and scheduled an appointment, his heart pounding with both excitement and apprehension. The idea of putting his work into the hands of someone who could give it an official value was both thrilling and terrifying. What if the appraisal didn't match his expectations? What if the world still rejected his art, despite everything he had poured into it? On the day of the appraisal, Xavier gathered a selection of his best works, carefully chosen pieces that told the story of his journey as an artist, pieces that he had poured his soul into. He was nervous as he transported them to the appraiser's office, but he knew this was the right step. The city streets blurred past him as he made his way to the gallery-like office building in the heart of downtown. The world outside felt different today, as though the air had shifted, the rhythm of his steps matching the beat of a new, unknown possibility. When he arrived, Julia Collins greeted him with a warmth that put him at ease. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, and she immediately struck Xavier as someone who valued art for its intrinsic worth, not for the fame or prestige attached to it. After exchanging pleasantries, they moved into a large, open room where his works were laid out, one by one, for her evaluation. Julia took her time with each piece, carefully examining the brushstrokes, the composition, the colors. Her silence during the process was not one of disinterest, but of deep concentration. Xavier watched her as she moved from one painting to the next, her fingers gently tracing the edges of the canvas, as though she were reading the emotions embedded in each layer of paint. The minutes stretched on, but Xavier felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. This was different from any other moment in his artistic career. This wasn't about fitting into someone else's idea of art. This was about the art itself, the soul of it. Finally, Julia set down her pen and looked up at him. Her expression was unreadable, and for a moment, Xavier feared that she might echo the same dismissive sentiments he had heard so many times before. But instead, her eyes sparkled with something far more profound: recognition, respect, and perhaps even awe. "These pieces," she began slowly, "are extraordinary, Xavier. I don't say that lightly. You've created something that is truly unique. It's clear you've tapped into something deep, something that resonates far beyond the surface of what most people are willing to look at. The colors, the energy, the stories embedded in these works, they're powerful. They hold weight, and they are full of life." Xavier blinked in surprise. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. He had heard compliments, of course, but this was different. This was a recognition of the depth of his work, of the layers he had painstakingly built into each piece. Julia continued, her voice steady and full of admiration. "Your work is not just good, Xavier. It's important. It has a narrative that demands attention. And not just from small buyers or niche collectors. No, this is the kind of art that belongs in major collections. Your paintings belong in the same league as the greats. You've got something here that's more than just art. You've got a voice, one that has been silenced for far too long." Xavier's heart raced as Julia's words sank in. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. She wasn't just offering polite praise, she was stating a truth that resonated with everything he had felt deep down but had never been able to articulate. He had always known that his work was worth more than it was being given credit for. But hearing it from someone who wasn't involved in the politics of the art world, someone who was a true professional, was an experience unlike any other. Julia stood up and walked over to a file cabinet, pulling out a large, official-looking document. "Based on my evaluation," she said, turning back to him, "I've calculated the potential value of these works. I've compared them to similar pieces in the market, adjusted for rarity, emotional resonance, and historical importance." She paused for effect, then handed him the appraisal. "Xavier, your collection is worth millions. Your work is not just valuable. It's priceless." Xavier stared at the sheet in his hands, his mind struggling to process the numbers printed before him. Millions. His art, his raw, unrefined, unappreciated art, was worth millions. The realization was a flood, a deluge, that threatened to overwhelm him with both disbelief and elation. For so long, he had fought against the system, against the prejudices that sought to keep his work confined to the margins. But now, the truth was undeniable: his work had value far beyond what anyone had ever predicted. It was not just worth what a few collectors were willing to pay, it was worth the recognition, the fame, the place in history that he had always dreamed of. Xavier felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away. This was not the moment for tears. This was the moment of revelation, of understanding his own worth, not just as an artist, but as a human being who had persevered against all odds. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse, the words barely able to escape. "I never imagined." "You don't have to thank me," Julia replied, her smile kind. "You've earned every ounce of this recognition, Xavier. You've fought for it. Now the world is going to see it." As Xavier left the appraisal office, the streets outside felt different. The weight of the world had lifted, replaced by the thrill of possibility. The road ahead was no longer defined by rejection or prejudice. The world had just learned what he had known all along: his art was not just valuable, it was vital. And from this moment forward, Xavier knew that the narrative of his life had changed forever. The world would see him not just as a black artist trying to break through, but as a true force in the art world, a force that could not be ignored any longer. Weeks had passed since Xavier's revelation. The weight of his newfound knowledge had not diminished; if anything, it had deepened his resolve. He knew the value of his work now, not just in terms of dollars and cents, but in the way it carried with it a message that could not be silenced. He was no longer a struggling artist on the fringes, hoping for validation. He was a force to be reckoned with. His art had not only been appraised for millions, it had found its rightful place in the greater narrative of the art world. But what Xavier hadn't expected was the unexpected encounter that would soon put everything he had worked for to the test. Harold Finch, the very same gallery owner who had dismissed him so callously, had recently reached out to him. Xavier had been surprised when the message came through. Finch wanted to meet again, to discuss a potential partnership. At first, Xavier had been skeptical. After all, Finch was the same man who had ridiculed his work, who had belittled him and suggested that he needed to adjust his style to fit a more conventional mold. But the possibility of working with such a high-profile gallery could not be entirely ignored. It was a way to push his art further into the public eye, to take the next step in his journey. Xavier decided to play along. He wasn't so naive as to think Finch had changed his attitude. No, Finch was not the type to suddenly recognize the value of an artist just because he had been proven wrong. Instead, Xavier was curious. He wanted to see how far Finch was willing to go now that he knew Xavier's true worth, both as an artist and as a commodity. So, he agreed to the meeting. What better way to show Finch the very lesson he had failed to learn? The meeting was set for a crisp Thursday afternoon. Xavier entered Finch's gallery, his step steady, his mind clear. The same polished space, the same empty walls, greeted him. But this time, the air felt different. It felt charged, as though it knew something Finch hadn't yet realized. Xavier walked past the well-curated pieces on the walls, his eyes sharp as he observed the work of other artists. The paintings and sculptures were all the same, safe, predictable, and ultimately forgettable. There was nothing here that spoke to the soul the way Xavier's work did. It was, in many ways, the perfect metaphor for his past, empty, conventional, and lacking in depth. Harold Finch greeted him at the door, his expression as cold and self-assured as it had been the first time they met. His suit was impeccable, and his smile, though friendly, did not quite reach his eyes. "Xavier, glad you could make it," Finch said, shaking his hand with the same firm, almost mechanical grip. Xavier returned the handshake, his grip just as firm but with an air of quiet confidence. He had learned a lot since their last meeting. No longer was he the eager, starry-eyed artist hoping for a chance. Now, he was the one in control of the narrative, and Finch would soon learn that. "I'm glad you reached out, Mr. Finch," Xavier said calmly. "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation." Finch smirked, his eyes narrowing as he motioned for Xavier to follow him deeper into the gallery. "Ah, yes. I remember. You were quite passionate, if I recall correctly. Well, I'm glad you've reconsidered and agreed to meet with me again. There's a lot of potential here for you, you know? My clients have a taste for bold new work, and I think your pieces, if properly adjusted, could fit that taste quite nicely." Xavier held back a smile, knowing Finch's words were the prelude to an even greater condescension. "Yes, I remember your suggestions quite well," Xavier replied. "And I've taken them into account." Finch led him to a small table where they both sat, and a tense silence filled the space between them. "I think it's time we talk business, Xavier," Finch continued, his tone cool and transactional. "I've had a few of my buyers express some interest in your work. They're intrigued by your unique style. But, of course, they'll need to see some refinement. A little more sophistication, shall we say? A few adjustments to the presentation, the framing, maybe even a change in color palette here and there. Nothing drastic, of course, but enough to make the work more saleable." Xavier could feel the old tension rising within him. Finch was speaking as though he were doing Xavier a favor, as though his work was still in need of some transformation before it could meet the standard of true art. But Xavier was no longer the artist who would meekly accept such advice. He had seen his value, and he knew that the art world's view of sophistication was often a thin veil for something far less genuine. "That's interesting, Mr. Finch," Xavier said, his voice calm but with an edge of quiet power. "But I've come to realize something recently, something important." Finch leaned back in his chair, a slight grin tugging at his lips. "Oh? Do tell, Xavier. What epiphany has struck you? I'm sure it's a fascinating one." Xavier didn't flinch at Finch's mocking tone. He knew what was coming. "I've come to realize that my work, the way it stands now, is already sophisticated. It's already powerful. In fact, it's worth far more than I think even you realize. Finch laughed, a low, dismissive chuckle. You know, I've heard a lot of artists say that, Xavier. They all believe their work is priceless. But the reality is, art is about more than just a pretty picture. It's about marketability, and about being able to tap into what buyers are looking for. And trust me, there's no market for what you're offering, at least, not unless you're willing to make some concessions. Xavier's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. He had been patient up until now, but he was done being underestimated. He wasn't here to fight with Finch, but to show him just how wrong he had been. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out the official appraisal document, the same one Julia Collins had given him just weeks before, and placed it gently on the table. Finch's eyes flicked to the document, his expression momentarily shifting from confident to curious. What's this? An appraisal, Xavier said, his voice steady and unyielding. A professional one. Of my work. My real worth. Finch's eyes narrowed, clearly intrigued but unwilling to admit anything. I see. And how much is this work of yours worth, Xavier? A few thousand, perhaps? Maybe a bit more if we're lucky? Xavier didn't respond immediately. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting Finch stew in his own assumptions. Finally, he spoke, his words carrying weight. According to this appraisal, Mr. Finch, my work is valued at millions. Millions, far beyond what you or anyone in your circle could have predicted. My pieces are not just interesting or unique, they are priceless in their own right. Finch's jaw tightened, the color draining from his face as he glanced down at the document. His expression shifted from smug confidence to disbelief. You're joking, right? He asked, though his voice trembled slightly. Xavier's eyes held a quiet power, one that reflected the depth of everything he had fought for. No joke, Mr. Finch. This is the truth. And I don't need to refine or adjust my work to make it more marketable. What I create is already valuable. It always has been. For a moment, Finch said nothing. He stared at the appraisal as if it were some kind of trick. The reality of the situation was slowly dawning on him. Xavier, the artist he had dismissed, the one he had tried to belittle, was not the one who needed validation anymore. The power was now in Xavier's hands, and Finch, the gallery owner, was the one who would have to adjust. Xavier leaned forward, his calm demeanor now tinged with a quiet but undeniable authority. I think you underestimated me, Mr. Finch. And now, the tables have turned. Finch swallowed hard, the arrogance in his eyes replaced with the sting of humiliation. He had assumed that Xavier was just another artist desperate for recognition, someone he could mold and control. But Xavier was no longer that person. He had seen the true worth of his art, and now, he was in charge of the narrative. And Harold Finch, for all his supposed expertise, was nothing more than a player in a game he didn't understand. Xavier stood up, his decision final. I don't need your gallery to showcase my work, Mr. Finch. If you want it, you'll have to meet me on my terms. I'm not the one who needs your validation anymore. It's time you recognize that. As Xavier walked out of the gallery, the weight of the moment hung in the air like the closing of a door. Finch could no longer look down on him. The art world was changing, and Xavier was at the forefront of that change. The streets of the city that Xavier had once walked with a heart full of doubt now felt different beneath his feet. They were familiar, yet they had transformed in his mind. A landscape that had once seemed hostile now felt like the canvas of his future, waiting to be painted with the strokes of his own choosing. Xavier had finally done it. He had broken through the walls of rejection, the glass ceilings that had kept him confined, and now he was standing at the threshold of a new world. The world he had once dreamed of. The world that was now his to shape. The day after his encounter with Harold Finch, Xavier had made a decision. It was a bold one, a move that would shake the art world to its core. He would no longer be at the mercy of gallery owners, critics, and those who believed they had the power to define him. He would take matters into his own hands. The time had come for him to buy the very gallery that had once mocked him, the very gallery that had tried to belittle his talent, dismiss his worth, and silence his voice. The gallery that had once closed its doors to him would now become a symbol of his strength, his triumph over a system that had tried to keep him down. The idea came to him in a flash: why wait for someone else to validate him when he could create his own path? Why beg for space in an industry that had overlooked his potential for so long? What if he could become the one who decided who and what had a place in the art world? What if, instead of being just another artist hoping for a break, he could become a figure with the power to shape the very future of the industry itself? Xavier didn't waste time on indecision. Armed with the appraisal that had confirmed his work was worth millions, he had the financial means to make this bold move. The first step was to reach out to a lawyer, someone who could handle the logistics of buying out the gallery. The second step was to contact a real estate agent, someone who could help him secure the rights to the building that housed Finch's gallery. The process was complex, but Xavier was undeterred. He understood the power of this move, and he knew it was the only way forward. As he sat in his modest office, reviewing documents and making phone calls, Xavier's heart raced, not with fear, but with excitement. He was on the verge of something monumental. In a world where so many had tried to silence him, he was about to speak louder than ever before. His comeback wasn't just about proving himself as an artist. It was about taking control of his destiny, about turning the tables and showing the world that true power didn't lie in the hands of those who mocked or rejected him, it lay within himself. Months passed as Xavier navigated the complexities of the deal. He met with bankers, signed contracts, and worked tirelessly to secure his vision. Every step was a reminder of the hurdles he had overcome, and the dreams he had refused to let go of. He remembered the nights when he had doubted himself, when the weight of rejection had almost crushed him. But now, with each signature, with each piece of the puzzle falling into place, he was proving that his vision, his persistence, had never been in vain. Finally, the day came when Xavier stood in front of the gallery, the building that had once belonged to Harold Finch, now officially his. The doors that had been closed to him were now wide open. He had purchased the very space that had dismissed him, and now it was his to do with as he pleased. His name would be the one that adorned the walls, his vision the one that guided the exhibitions. He was no longer just an artist looking for a place to showcase his work, he was now a buyer, a collector, a powerful figure who had the ability to shape the future of the art world. Xavier didn't waste time basking in the glory of his success. No, this was just the beginning. As soon as the deal was finalized, he began the transformation of the gallery. It was no longer going to be a place that catered to the narrow tastes of elite buyers. It was going to be a space that celebrated diversity, that welcomed artists from all walks of life, and that showcased the full spectrum of creativity and expression. It would be a gallery that focused on inclusivity, breaking down the walls that had once divided artists based on race, gender, or social status. Xavier's gallery would be a beacon of change, a place where art was judged not by its marketability but by its authenticity, its emotional resonance, and its ability to challenge the status quo. He personally oversaw every detail of the gallery's renovation. The white walls that had once felt sterile and lifeless were replaced with warm, inviting hues, colors that reflected the vibrancy and diversity of the art world he envisioned. The floors, once sleek and cold, were softened with hardwood that added a touch of warmth to the space. The lighting was carefully chosen to highlight the beauty and depth of each piece, to bring out the emotions and stories that each artwork told. Every corner of the gallery was infused with Xavier's vision, a vision that was rooted in his own experiences as an artist, but also in his desire to create a space where other artists like him could thrive. The first exhibition was a carefully curated collection of works that reflected Xavier's journey, from the raw, powerful pieces that had earned him his first recognition to the new works that showcased the growth and evolution of his artistry. But it wasn't just about his work, it was about the work of other artists who, like him, had been overlooked and underestimated. He invited artists from all backgrounds, emerging talent from marginalized communities, people of color, women, LGBTQ+ artists, anyone whose work had been dismissed by the mainstream art world because they didn't fit the prescribed mold. The opening night of the gallery was an event like no other. The air was electric with excitement as artists, collectors, critics, and art enthusiasts flooded the space. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of anticipation and awe. People were seeing something they had never seen before, a gallery that wasn't afraid to embrace new voices, new perspectives, and new ideas. It was a place where art was celebrated not for its market value, but for its ability to connect with the soul. It was a place where diversity was not just tolerated but celebrated. As Xavier walked through the gallery that night, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The gallery was a testament to everything he had worked for, everything he had overcome. He had come from a place of rejection, of being overlooked and dismissed, to standing in front of a space that now bore his name, a space that would shape the future of the art world. The feeling was surreal, but it was also deeply satisfying. He had built this from the ground up, and it was more than just a place to showcase art, it was a movement. In the weeks that followed, word of Xavier's gallery spread like wildfire. Critics who had once dismissed him were now lining up to write glowing reviews of the space, praising its inclusivity and the boldness of its vision. Collectors who had once ignored his work were now clamoring to own pieces from the artist Xavier had championed. The industry, which had once shunned him, was now forced to reckon with his power and influence. Xavier's gallery became a cultural hub, a place where the boundaries of art were constantly being pushed, and where artists from all walks of life could find their voices. It was a place that fostered creativity, where the traditional rules of the art world were questioned and redefined. It was a space where art was not just a commodity, but a reflection of the diverse, complex world we live in. And Xavier, once a struggling artist trying to make a name for himself, was now at the forefront of a movement that would change the art world forever. As he stood in the center of his gallery, looking around at the vibrant works of art that filled the space, Xavier knew that his comeback wasn't just about personal success. It was about creating a new path for the generations of artists who would follow him, artists who, like him, had been told they weren't enough, that their voices didn't matter. His gallery was a testament to the idea that true art is not defined by who owns it or who recognizes it, but by the power it has to change the world. And in that moment, Xavier realized that the world was finally beginning to listen. The air was electric with excitement as artists, collectors, critics, and art enthusiasts flooded the space. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of anticipation and awe. People were seeing something they had never seen before, a gallery that wasn't afraid to embrace new voices, new perspectives, and new ideas. It was a place where art was celebrated not for its market value, but for its ability to connect with the soul. It was a place where diversity was not just tolerated but celebrated. As Xavier walked through the gallery that night, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The gallery was a testament to everything he had worked for, everything he had overcome. He had come from a place of rejection, of being overlooked and dismissed, to standing in front of a space that now bore his name, a space that would shape the future of the art world. The feeling was surreal, but it was also deeply satisfying. He had built this from the ground up, and it was more than just a place to showcase art, it was a movement. In the weeks that followed, word of Xavier's gallery spread like wildfire. Critics who had once dismissed him were now lining up to write glowing reviews of the space, praising its inclusivity and the boldness of its vision. Collectors who had once ignored his work were now clamoring to own pieces from the artist Xavier had championed. The industry, which had once shunned him, was now forced to reckon with his power and influence. Xavier's gallery became a cultural hub, a place where the boundaries of art were constantly being pushed, and where artists from all walks of life could find their voices. It was a place that fostered creativity, where the traditional rules of the art world were questioned and redefined. It was a space where art was not just a commodity, but a reflection of the diverse, complex world we live in. And Xavier, once a struggling artist trying to make a name for himself, was now at the forefront of a movement that would change the art world forever. As he stood in the center of his gallery, looking around at the vibrant works of art that filled the space, Xavier knew that his comeback wasn't just about personal success. It was about creating a new path for the generations of artists who would follow him, artists who, like him, had been told they weren't enough, that their voices didn't matter. His gallery was a testament to the idea that true art is not defined by who owns it or who recognizes it, but by the power it has to change the world. And in that moment, Xavier realized that the world was finally beginning to listen. Xavier stood there for a moment, his posture calm, but his eyes unwavering. He had heard these words before, these same dismissive remarks. He knew exactly where they were coming from. Finch's words weren't just about art. They were about a belief that people like Xavier didn't belong in the spaces Finch had carved out for himself and his peers. It was about race, about status, and about the arrogance that allowed men like Finch to dismiss the brilliance in front of them simply because it didn't look like their idea of success. Xavier stepped forward slowly, the weight of the moment not lost on him. He was not the man Finch had once thought he was. He was no longer an artist on the edge of failure. He was the artist who had become the very force that Finch could no longer ignore. "You don't understand, do you, Harold?" Xavier's voice was steady, but it carried the quiet power of a man who had lived through enough to know what true success meant. "You still think this is about luck, about timing. But what you don't realize is that this was never about timing or luck. It was always about talent. It was always about my work. And most importantly, it was about recognizing that talent for what it truly is, without judgment, without prejudice, without the confines of a narrow, elitist view of art." Finch's face flushed with irritation. He stood up from his chair, his arms crossed defensively. "You think you've earned something, Xavier, that you've done something that others like me could never understand? That's laughable. You didn't build this gallery, you just bought it. You didn't earn success, you just lucked into it." Xavier's eyes hardened, but his voice remained calm. "I didn't luck into anything. I built this from the ground up. I took every rejection, every closed door, and used it as fuel to push forward. You didn't see the value in me. You didn't see the value in my work. And that's where you went wrong. I'm not here to be your project. I'm not here to conform to the narrow view of what you think art should be. I'm here because I knew that I had something worth fighting for." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Finch's face had shifted from arrogance to confusion, but Xavier was just getting started. "You told me that my work wasn't refined enough. That I needed to adjust to fit the mold. What you didn't see, and what you'll never understand, is that true art doesn't need to fit anyone's mold. It doesn't need to be made palatable for a select group of people. Art is supposed to challenge. It's supposed to make people uncomfortable. But instead, you chose to play it safe. You chose to exclude what didn't fit your image of what art should be. You chose to ignore talent because it didn't fit your narrow view of what was worthy." Finch opened his mouth to say something, but Xavier held up a hand, silencing him. "No, Harold. You need to hear this. You need to understand what you missed, what you were too blinded." In the heart of the city, where the pulse of creativity and culture beat like the rhythm of a drum, Xavier Williams had created something extraordinary. What began as a dream born from rejection and doubt had blossomed into a legacy that transcended the limitations imposed on him by a biased art world. His gallery, a space that had once been owned by Harold Finch, now stood as a testament to everything Xavier had overcome: the prejudice, the mockery, the systemic racism that had tried to define him and his work. But Xavier had refused to be confined by the limitations of others' expectations. He had transformed the very structure that had once shut him out into a sanctuary of empowerment, a place where art was no longer judged by the color of the artist's skin, the shape of their background, or the narrow definitions of high art. It was a space for everyone who had been told that they weren't enough, that their voices didn't matter. And now, Xavier was determined to take it even further. As the years passed, Xavier's influence grew exponentially. His gallery became a symbol of inclusion and diversity in the art world. The walls, once adorned with the work of a select few, now boasted a dazzling array of pieces, each one telling a story that had been ignored or overlooked for far too long. Xavier didn't just want to showcase his own work, he wanted to uplift others who had struggled to gain a foothold in the industry, particularly those from marginalized communities. He knew firsthand how it felt to be invisible, to be dismissed as a mere footnote in the art world's long and storied history. But now, he was in a position to change that. Xavier's gallery became known for its willingness to take risks, to defy the traditional boundaries of the art world. It was a place where emerging artists from all backgrounds could show their work, artists of color, women, LGBTQ+ artists, and others whose voices had been systematically silenced by the art establishment. These were the voices Xavier had fought to hear, the ones whose stories resonated with authenticity and power. He actively sought out talent that was often overlooked, giving them a platform where their work could be seen and valued for what it truly was, art that mattered, art that told the stories of real people and real experiences. The exhibitions at Xavier's gallery were nothing short of revolutionary. Each show was an exploration of the human condition, an invitation for visitors to see the world through different eyes. One exhibit might showcase the work of a group of Black artists exploring the complexities of identity, history, and resilience. Another might highlight the vibrant, untold stories of women whose work had been relegated to the margins of the art world for centuries. Each exhibition was an immersive experience that challenged the traditional, Eurocentric view of art history and opened doors for new perspectives. Xavier's commitment to diversity was not just a political statement, it was a reflection of his belief that true art was meant to reflect the full spectrum of human experience, not just the stories that were deemed acceptable by the elite. But Xavier's influence didn't stop within the confines of his own gallery. He became a mentor to many young artists, providing them with the tools, guidance, and opportunities they needed to navigate the complexities of the art world. He understood the struggles they faced, and he was determined to make their paths easier than his had been. Through workshops, collaborations, and public forums, Xavier worked tirelessly to foster a community of artists who felt empowered to create without fear of judgment or rejection. He didn't just offer his support to artists he showcased in his gallery, he extended his reach to the broader art community, creating a network of like-minded individuals who were all committed to challenging the status quo and pushing the boundaries of what art could be. In the public eye, Xavier became a symbol of perseverance and defiance. His story, once one of struggle and rejection, was now one of triumph. He was invited to speak at conferences, to lead panels on the importance of diversity in the arts, and to share his experience of navigating a world that had initially sought to silence him. His voice became a powerful tool for advocacy, as he used his platform to raise awareness about the systemic racism that still plagued the art industry. He didn't shy away from talking about the difficulties he had faced. Instead, he used his story to inspire others to keep fighting, to keep creating, and to never let the prejudices of others define their worth. One of the most poignant moments in Xavier's journey came when he received an award for his contributions to the arts and to social justice. As he stood on the stage, accepting the honor before a room full of industry leaders and artists, he thought back to the days when he had first walked into that sterile gallery, hoping for a break, hoping for someone to see his talent. He thought of Harold Finch and the way his rejection had felt, how it had threatened to crush his spirit. But now, standing in front of the crowd, Xavier realized how far he had come, not just as an artist, but as a force for change in the industry. He spoke of the importance of representation in the arts, of the need for every voice to be heard, regardless of race, background, or social status. Art is the reflection of humanity, he said, his voice steady and powerful. And if we are to truly understand the world, we must allow all its voices to be heard. For too long, the art world has been controlled by a narrow, exclusionary view of what's worthy. But art belongs to everyone. It belongs to those who have been silenced, to those who have been dismissed, to those who have been told their voices don't matter. And it is through art that we can reclaim our power, our truth, and our place in this world. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Xavier knew that the work was far from over. While his own legacy as an artist and gallery owner had been solidified, there was still so much left to do. He was only one piece of the puzzle in the ongoing fight for a more inclusive and equitable art world. He knew that his gallery could never be the only place where marginalized voices were heard, it was just one part of a larger movement. But in that moment, standing before the audience, he realized that he had created something that would outlast him. His legacy wasn't just about his work, it was about the lives he had touched, the artists he had uplifted, and the doors he had opened for those who would come after him. The walls of his gallery, once a symbol of exclusion, were now filled with the stories of countless artists who had once been told they didn't belong. His name, Xavier Williams, became synonymous with resilience, with the power of art to break barriers, and with the importance of creating a space where everyone's voice could be heard. The art world had been changed forever, and Xavier had been at the heart of that transformation. As the years went on, Xavier's gallery continued to thrive, becoming one of the most respected and influential institutions in the art world. But more than the accolades and the recognition, it was the artists whose lives he had touched that mattered most to him. He had created a platform where artists could create freely, without fear of being silenced or overlooked. He had given them the tools and the space to succeed, and in doing so, he had left behind a legacy that would continue to inspire future generations. Xavier's story was no longer just his own. It had become a story of triumph for every artist who had ever been told they didn't belong. And as the years passed, his legacy lived on, not just in the work he created, but in the countless artists who had found their place in the world because of the path he had paved for them.